Welcome to Watching the Throne, a lyrical analysis of Kanye West. My name's Chris Lambert, and today we have a special guest on the show, Cole Cuchna from the Dissect podcast. Cole, you want to say anything about yourself?
Yeah, what's up, man? I'm just happy to talk to you. It's always a good time. This is I think our third time recording a pod together, so this one should be good.
Yeah, it's funny. It was actually the time frame between the first time we talked and recorded a pod to now that made me really excited to do this one, because when we first talked, it was 2017, and right before or in the early stages of your My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy series. And it's been 2 years at this point, but so much has changed. You've covered so many artists. I just was really excited to get to talk to you again and pick your brain on some things.
Yeah, it's like I was thinking about the first thing we did 2 years ago. I recorded it. I was still working full time at a job that was not Dissect. And I recorded it on my quote unquote break at work, which wasn't really a break. I just recorded it on the clock. But I had a little tiny office that I kind of had to myself, and there's a little back room that I went and crawled into to record, so no one saw me recording it. But anyways, a lot has definitely changed in 2 years for the better, and this is kind of full circle, coming back and being on the pod.
Yeah, which, I mean, the My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy season went really well. You got a lot of attention and some press for To Pimp a Butterfly, especially with the density of that album, and people were really looking for kind of a Virgil to help them guide them through the inferno that was like that album, and just understand what was going on. But it felt like with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, things really ramped up in terms of the recognition you were getting.
Yeah, that season definitely made, I would say, in terms of audience, it made the show. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think, like you probably know, starting a podcast and growing an audience is really, really, really hard to do, and even harder now because there's so many podcasts. So that was kind of working against me. It being a pretty niche podcast and not really one for everyone was also kind of working against me. But I think also the content got better with season 2. Season 2 was when I started to bring the musical aspects. Like in season 1, Kendrick was so lyrical heavy that there wasn't much room for musical analysis, and he's not a producer like Kanye is, so I didn't feel like it was as justified to talk about that stuff, although if I did it again I would. But Kanye allowed me to speak to the music in a way that I thought was justified, since he was producing everything, or kind of overseeing the production of everything. And I feel like that took the show to the next level. And obviously, I think more than anything, Kanye is just such a magnet for content and attention that when someone hears, there's an entire podcast dedicated to Kanye West and his quote unquote best album ever, in many people's view, it was just kind of, the synergy was all there. So, it was the perfect choice in retrospect. I couldn't have picked a better album and a better artist to kind of propel Dissect. So yeah, it all just kind of happened, and really led me to what I'm doing now, which is doing Dissect full time, which is a dream come true.
When you followed up, following like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, was there a lot more pressure in trying to figure out what the next album would be, like being aware of the attention that My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy got you?
There's more pressure, I would say, all the way around. Just knowing you have an audience, you try not to let it change you, but it inevitably does, or at least it makes you second guess things that maybe you wouldn't have previously second guessed, just because that imaginary audience is kind of always over your shoulder. Which was, a little bit difficult. I wouldn't say difficult to deal with, but it's definitely something you have to confront. And, the funny thing was, Kendrick, To Pimp a Butterfly was all about him dealing with fame and so was Kanye's Dark Twisted Fantasy. Really, was him kind of dealing with fame and also the aftermath of the dark side of fame, I guess. And definitely not comparing myself to Kendrick or Kanye at all, but just the small glimpse of attention that Dissect got really made me understand their struggle even more, because it was what I was experiencing, except times 10 million or whatever exponential number it would be. But it really gave me more empathy into artists in general. That transition of just, it is, especially with Kanye and I guess Kendrick now too. It's like anything they say, we're speaking off the air about the upcoming Kanye Letterman interview, literally anything Kanye says is going to make news. It does not matter what it is. And that has to weigh on you. It's almost like a prison in some ways. Like you want to express yourself, but you know that the scrutiny is so intense that it's human nature to just kind of second guess yourself all the time, or really like everything becomes strategized, or you're not really allowed to just kind of exist because there's this big microscope on you. And To Pimp a Butterfly was exactly that. Kendrick dealing with that, and again, it was kind of a nice little insight to the actual albums that I was dissecting. Was to experience that on a very micro level, but it does give you the insight to imagine what it might be like at a macro level,
And I'm sure there's kind of some comfort you can then draw from those albums because that attention is what you've been searching for in a lot of ways when you do a show, because it's what helps you break through and get like the show popular in the next level. But at the same time, those negative emotions that are inherently part of the experience, to know that Kendrick and Kanye also go through those things. Like the Kit Harington from Game of Thrones recently had to check himself into rehab because he was experiencing such stress from the ending of Game of Thrones. Or Katy Perry not making an album for years and years because she was feeling that kind of pressure and anxiety. Not to say that, it's good that they're experiencing, but just the idea that I'm not the only one experiencing some degree of this, and there's this kind of human connectedness that happens there, even in the negativity, which is kind of beautiful in some ways.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%, and I try to provide those insights in Dissect when I'm, I always try to think of any artist that I'm dissecting as human first, and really exemplify those human qualities in artists that we really admire, because a lot of times an artist gets so big that they become like, there's a kind of an inherent dehumanization process in fame, and you become this kind of object almost, and this content wheel, and people just start thinking you as content, or as what can you give me, essentially. We ask for albums, we're always asking for new music, we're always asking for more from these artists that already give us so much. And I think if we lose sight of the human quality of the artists that we admire, it really does us and them a disservice, because they should be our kind of guiding light into some of the struggles that we all face on a daily basis. Kendrick talking about his mental health issues, specifically on a song like You, or on Like You, where he's literally crying and just expressing the pressure that he's feeling and the remorse that he has for leaving Compton because of the success that he had. All that stuff is so human, and again, it's like we can't let their fame kind of eclipse their human characteristics, or else it almost defeats the purpose of what they're doing, which is, I always believe, which is art at the ground level. They are artists, and they're providing the world with art that gives beautiful insights into the human experience. And that's kind of like the motto, or the goal that I set out. Specifically, I say it in the show, we're going to learn more about the human experience through this album, through this piece of art, which I think across, film, painting, any art. That's really what the best art does. That's the underlying quality of any great art, is to express human experience and to provide insight into the human experience, so that we actually can evolve as people. And they're kind of like these monoliths, these things that everyone can consume and learn from, and gather around, to really kind of push. I not to kind of speak too grandly, but to really push humanity forward. I really feel like art contributes so much to that, and that's kind of what the show, Dissect, is all about, and really clarifying that for people. Because I don't know I would be interested to hear what you think about this, but like, people love music so much, I would say probably more than any other art form. People just feel music, it connects with them like anything else, but they can't always explain why it does that. And I think you don't need to know why, but I think there are insights to be gathered when you know why. And again, that's kind of what the show Dissect is about. It's providing those insights in a way that everyone can understand and help clarify why this music is resonating so much. And I think that for a lot of people, that's a great service to kind of get that clarity of the feeling that they already are kind of intrinsically feeling about the music.
That's always been one of the interesting things to me regarding conversation about Kanye's discography is so dynamic, and he really did have that. I tend to view My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy as this balance point where he merged all of his pop tendencies with all of his artistic tendencies.
Yep.
And you got this very well-balanced crossroads of the two, where before it was a lot more pop mentality than art mentality, and afterwards we've seen more art mentality than pop mentality with Yeezus and Life of Pablo and Ye just being much more avant-garde in a way than College Dropout and Late Registration were. And there's some people that really respond to the music of the first part way more than the latter, and those former albums, just because they do hit on that visceral level and do allow, I think, easier accessibility in terms of getting at what the very just superficial level of the emotions are. And people can really love that while not liking or wanting to experience the deeper level of some of the most recent albums, where others really want the deeper level, and that's what resonates with them more than the front half. And it's always interesting then seeing people talk about Kanye's discography, and some that will just completely champion the front half, hate the back half, or completely champion the back half and kind of dismiss the front half, when, I don't know, both. I just think it's incredible he's done both. Mm-hmm. And gives his audience such a wide variety of, I don't know, experiences, and that each one's kind of doing this unique thing that you can go to each album and really experience something different. But that is one of the cool things about music, is that it hits viscerally, but it's also can be very difficult unless you're doing the kind of like close reading analyses that we do on each of our shows to sometimes get the deeper meaning from an album, which I don't know, there can be a lot that ends up being lost in the listening experience sometimes, which is a shame, because some of these albums really do deserve like just sitting down and paying as much attention as you would to a novel or a movie that's considered this great work. But I think with how often we view music as just like pop music, just radio music, sometimes that gets lost.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, it's difficult. The way that we consume music, I think, is somewhat problematic. I'm speaking from a bias. I'm a musician, have been forever. So, but I do think that's true. I think when we sit down for a movie, especially if we go to a theater, we're not looking on our phones. We're not, our attention is undivided to that experience, where I feel like if you ask 99 out of 100 people if the last time that they sat down and just listened to an entire album from front to back and did nothing else, didn't look at their phone, it would, 99 times out of 100, you'd get a no. Like, I've never done that, or it's been 15 years, or I would say likely probably never. So I don't know if that's a criticism of what we're doing, but I think there's definitely value in sitting down and listening to music, especially if you find yourself really drawn to it. I'm always a big advocate for, we know our intrinsic kind of instincts will tell us way more than, there's a reason for those instincts. So if you're attracted to an album and you're listening to it over and over and I love this album, whenever it comes on, I just feel something. Like I think that's your body or your mind telling you something. Like there's something deeper there. And I can't tell you how many times, like, especially like for To Pimp a Butterfly, especially, where someone was like, I didn't really understand, I love this album, but I didn't really understand it until you broke it down in the podcast. And now I appreciate it, X amount of times more than I ever did, which is always for me, like the greatest feedback, because that's the validation of, I love this album, didn't quite understand it totally, but now having understood it, more, it only deepened my appreciation and connection to it. And I learned, so many things about Kendrick and about, his experience and my own experience through understanding what he was talking about on a deeper level. And I think shows like yours, shows like mine, and just anything that really forces you to sit down and think about these things that you already love, it's just really, it's an important exercise, and one I feel like we can lose sight of, given how fast culture is starting to move with social media, cell phones, all that stuff, and that's only going to increase. And I guess my fear is that we lose these moments where, you're not spending a lot of your time with a million pieces of content, but you're spending a lot of your time on one piece of content, one piece of good content. Not every album or piece of art can undergo an analysis like we do on our shows, but for those rare and special works of art, I think we should find some time to learn everything that we can, extract everything we can from these things, because otherwise, it's kind of a waste, and it does a disservice to the music.
Yeah, imagine how many great albums have just kind of been lost in the ether just because they haven't had a platform to be discussed, or because they hit for a little while but then get lost in the cycle, which is kind of a shame to think about.
Yeah. I think, and just to add one more point, and I guess this is, I'm always attracted to the artists that can do both. So you kind of mentioned the first half of Kanye and the latter half of Kanye's discography, and Dark Twisted Fantasy being that middle point that kind of merged both. I feel exactly the same way. That's why I chose that album, was because it's kind of a bridge between old and new Kanye. But I always think the best artists could do both. That's why I'm so, kind of enamored with what Kendrick Lamar is doing. Because you have an album like Damn, which is a massive, massive commercial success, but that album is so deep. There's so much insight, so much message, and so much meaning kind of hidden in this commercially packaged album that it's an enjoyable listen for anyone that just wants surface level enjoyment for music, but it also has deeper meaning and potential for deep analysis for anyone like us that really enjoys that part of art. So, I think all the artists that I've selected to dissect do both. Frank Ocean's the same way. He kind of bridges the art world with the pop world. Tyler, with Flower Boy specifically, I felt did that. Lauryn Hill did that. And I think, I wouldn't say the best artists do that, but I would say I'm drawn to those type of artists because they have the most impact. To make very artful and meaningful content that is appealing to the masses is one of the hardest things to do as an artist, I think, hands down. That is such a hard bridge to kind of to balance both of those worlds, and just the impact alone that those artists can have and do have, and while simultaneously pushing art and boundaries of art forward, to me is incredibly admirable. And, that's why I pay so much attention to those artists, because just the impact that they have.
In covering the 4 artists that you've covered, well, 5 if we include Lauryn Hill, right? It's Kendrick, Kanye, Frank Ocean, Lauryn Hill, and Tyler the Creator. What has anything really surprised you about those artists, or did it really reconfirm or confirm what you were already feeling about them? Or I guess I'm curious just at the response to them as you've dove so deeply into their work.
Yeah, no, it's so I don't know if surprise is the right word. It's there's definitely surprises along the way. There's things that I discover that can only be discovered through scrutiny, through repetition of listening, through sitting down and just writing about, that entire album one song at a time. I would say the overall, it's not a surprising thing, but just the appreciation always deepens. There was never an album that I came out the other side of analysis was like, dang, that really didn't hold up to this scrutiny. It kind of fell under, you know what I mean? Like, which a lot of albums could easily do, which is why the most challenging part of what I do is actually selecting the album and selecting the right album. Otherwise it just falls on its face. But I think every time I go through the experience, I mean, I spend hundreds of hours with these, one album at a time, and the appreciation always deepens, which again, I think that's no small thing considering you're spending up to 300 hours with one piece of work. It's just, it makes sense to me. Like, I think people forget how much time and effort are taken to create these kinds of albums. If it takes Kendrick Lamar 2 solid years to create an album, and there's only 15 tracks on it, a lot of time and thought went into every nuance and detail of that album. So of course it's going to under scrutiny, it's going to hold up, which is opposite of a lot of artists who are kind of just pumping out surface level singles and hits, and that's fine. There's a place for that. But I think with these, to get back to your question, the underlying kind of experience with all of them has been a deeper appreciation for them as artists and as human beings. Because I think actually that's a more interesting point, is I feel like the appreciation deepens because their humanity to me increases as I dive deeper and deeper. Because when you do dive so deep, it's hard not to see the human side of these artists because they're laying it all out in their music. And so I start to get this really deep connection with them as people, not in an admiration way, but just in a, like, I feel like I know this person because they're so transparently expressing themselves in this music. And when you spend that much time with it, you just get this weird connection to them, which I think you could get on an intrinsic level, but you really get it. And I'm sure you've experienced it with Kanye's work, and maybe you can speak to that, but you do start to feel this really human connection with them through the art. Yeah,
it made me think and get to kind of the next question, this idea of songs that you maybe enjoyed or were more in the middle ground for you when you would listen to the album before, that after you do that kind of deep dive, you have a much different emotional experience with that song or connection to that song that's only born out of not just the intrinsic or initial visceral aesthetic experience, but from having that humanity in mind, having taken the time to understand the artist and the album in that way, that there's a song that hits you differently than it ever did before. I know with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, Hell of a Life.
Yeah, that's the exact song my mind went towards.
And there's just something, you hear that song the first time on the album, and you're like, this is enjoyable, it's catchy, it has some interesting lines, but when you really dive deep into My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy and know about Kanye, to just have it placed there between Runaway and Blame Game, there's just something very, I don't know, you can feel almost the a different level of emotion listening to it than ever before.
Yeah, yeah, and I think context for that is everything. Yeah, because like you said, where it's positioned, what it means to this like overall narrative arc, that kind of double meaning behind everything, the masturbation thing at the end, like it all ends up with this. Yeah, you get a like if you just listen to it on the surface, it's kind of like brash and it's just kind of a upbeat, kind of aggressive song, but it's really like lonely or depressing or sad or something when you experience it, knowing the context fully, where like you said, where it falls on the album. So that's exactly actually where my mind went. That was one of the songs that I was blown away with after I unpacked it. There's a lot of songs like that on Twisted Fantasy. Kendrick, I think, How Much a Dollar Cost was really a moving experience for me, one that really kind of changed my life in terms of how I see the world. I think it's pretty clear the story is that he sees a homeless guy at a gas station, doesn't give him money, and ends up being God. But once you know that is the turning point, that's kind of the crux of the entire album, where Kendrick finally turns the corner and starts to confront and deal with and overcome his struggles. That was one that was really, really moving to me. I think Frank Ocean, it's funny, I wasn't a huge Frank Ocean fan before season 3, and I always liked his music, but it was nothing I was ever insanely passionate about, and I really chose it because so many listeners requested it, and I was like, oh, there's got to be something here if the overwhelming consensus is that I have to do Frank Ocean next. And I really listen to the listeners, because I think a lot of the times they'll push me in directions that I wouldn't really explore if I were just left to my own instincts. And so I kind of chose that as a challenge, was like, well, I know something's here. I know there's enough to kind of unpack. So let me just choose it and see what happens. And, I came out the other side of that entire analysis, a huge, huge Frank Ocean fan, really, really appreciate what he's doing. His things are way more subtle, in terms of like his innovations, and his kind of nuances are just not always on the surface, but there's just some really, really beautiful moments throughout both albums, really. Specifically songs like Self-Control really, really changed my outlook on Frank Ocean in general. Just about every song I would be kind of like questioning how much is actually there when I would go into it. And then, of course, on the other side of the analysis, I'm like, wow, okay, there was definitely something there, and then some. So yeah, I don't know. I think every season's unique, in terms of surprise and discovery, but that's honestly my favorite part of the show is digging in and getting surprised and, just seeing what's there.
Talking about Frank Ocean and that, more like, is there anything here? I feel like we've had that happen on so many Kanye songs, where you go in and you're like, okay, I know that there's like an idea or a concept to the song, but like, how much depth is there really going on here? And then you start to see all these little connective moments where you're like, this choice just doesn't happen. Like maybe this one and this one, and maybe this one and this one, but this one, all connecting and adding up in this way. Like, yeah, that's what an artist does to signify like, this has meaning, this has depth. Yeah. And that's always such a fun thing to be able to, it's like being an archaeologist and finally finding the bone you've been digging for.
Yeah. That's exactly how I explain Dissect, is like, it's like anthropological. Is that a word? But it's like that exact experience of kind of digging and uncovering and just removing the dirt until it kind of crystallizes, which again is the best part.
We had mentioned books and movies before, and just getting into this idea of analysis, having spent as much time as you now have as kind of a scholar and critic of these works, do you find yourself viewing other media differently? Like when you watch a movie or TV show, are you watching it with more of that eye that you would bring to Dissect and looking at it, or is there kind of a disconnect when you're not working on a show? You just kind of let your brain go in that way of like, well, I don't have to analyze this movie to this degree.
No, it's kind of the opposite. I do it with everything now, which I like doing it, so it doesn't matter. It's fun for me to do that.
Same.
I go to the point where I'm like, I really want to dissect like Pixar movies, and like I'll do the same thing when I'm like reading books to my kids. Like I'll be like, oh, I see like the arc here. I see what they did with like the third act and blah blah blah. Like, so I guess anytime now, it's only just honed that sense, those senses in me, and it's honed that, I guess, skill set in a way, where I am able to actively enjoy a movie, but also simultaneously looking for the clues, looking for structure, looking for turning points, and all the things that are fun in a film or a book or anything narrative, really. Just because that's what I enjoy. That's how I'm going to get the most value and the most enjoyment and even entertainment out of something, is to analyze it on a deeper level. Of course, that's, there's levels to that. It only works with certain types of content, or you only can take it so far with certain types of content. But, anything structural is going to have, just by inherent, a movie wouldn't be possible without structure, with some kind of structure, or with some kind of, underlying themes or story being presented. So there's always something to kind of unpack, I feel like, or else it's just not possible to make, unless that's the actual concept itself, is to make a story about nothing, or to try to defy that. But yeah, I think it's in everything. It's in more than we realize. And I feel like the human experience is so story based. We define ourselves by our stories, if nothing else. So to unpack those stories and find parallels, etc., is just, it's everywhere. And once that part of your brain turns on, you find it in unexpected places. Do you have the same experience?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when we started the Kanye podcast, it was just a kind of a side hustle to what we were doing with our movie analysis. We had spent years doing this kind of these explanations of movie themes or endings or character choices that were kind of confusing to people. Like explaining the end of Ides of March was the first article I had that started gaining some traction, or writing a piece explaining the machinations that led up to Hulk smashing Loki in Avengers, and why that moment was so satisfying. It had been like low key built up to over the course of the of the film, to where they almost structured the whole movie and Loki's entire like character arc to make Hulk throwing him back and forth the most satisfying moment in the movie, to explaining the end of nocturnal animals or just things of that nature. And it was in refining those skills and looking at how movies did those things that we first kind of started noticing, Kanye's using a lot of these same structural choices or these same techniques on Yeezus. Like, how fun. Like, could that actually be what's happening on Yeezus? And starting to dive into it that way and be like, oh, no, yeah, this is exactly what's going on. And if you look, he did it on this album, and he did it here, and he did it throughout these songs. And then just going full tilt into that. And then being able to apply it how we talked about with Tyler, the Creator, and Igor. You see these similar choices that would be made in a movie to the point where you can imagine how the movie would play out. Yeah. Which I think to me is always one of the interesting tests for a narrative album. It's not a sure thing, because music can be so conceptual in a way. It doesn't have to be imagery driven or scene driven in the same way. But for narrative albums, kind of, you have that progress over time to where I can see each of these albums as how it would play out as a movie before I see them as albums, almost, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's that's the interesting thing about music and narrative is it's such a different structural, I don't know if constriction, but there's definitely, there's rules in music, and there's kind of rules to album making, that you're going to have separate songs, separate entities, which you could kind of think about as scenes, but not really. It doesn't quite translate. So that's what's so interesting about unpacking narrative albums to me, and I'm sure you have the same experience, where it's the narrative is clearly there in albums that are clearly narrative albums, but the way that they have to express that narrative and that overall arc is so different and so kind of weird, because you're kind of fitting like a square peg into a round hole type experience, where you're trying to use music and the album structure to tell this overarching story, which isn't as clear as sitting down and writing a script from start to finish. That's much more of a fluid and linear experience, whereas song making, especially if you've made songs yourself, it's like, how separate and compartmentalized that process can be. So to start thinking about that, and that's always the question that I wonder, if that would be the first question I'd have for any of the artists that I have dissected, is at what point were these just songs, and at what point was there a transition made to where you started to see this overall arc and started to create songs to fit that arc? Because there has to be some kind of switch, unless you just knew from day one what the concept was and it never changed. Maybe you would just right away start to construct the narrative. But I would guess, at least for the ones that I've dissected, there was a starting point where they're kind of just feeling out themes and concepts and just what they were feeling, and then after a few songs in, they kind of started seeing connections and then start writing to make those connections more fluid. That was definitely the case with Flower Boy, where Tyler had written, I think, Pothole and Dropping Seeds first, and he just wanted to make an album about flowers, but then it ended up turning into flowers was like this symbol and this metaphor for Tyler as a person, and growing and growth and maturation and all that. And then I was also kind of tying into the more feminine side of him. And then he started constructing songs, so much so that he starts to reference his own songs at the latter half of the album. Songs like November and Glitter literally reference the exact track numbers of the album's first half. So there's some point where that key is turned and they start creating this very structured narrative, but at some point I think it starts as something rough and then matures. The same with, like, I would say, To Pimp a Butterfly. Kendrick's, I would say, the most deliberate at narrative albums at this point. He always seems to put in some kind of thread that you can follow that kind of points to, hey, there's something else going on here aside from just each song. Which I find is cool. That's just kind of his style. But it's just cool to see the variance of how artists use music in the album format to tell these larger stories.
Yeah, and how they indicate that, right? Like Tyler might indicate it by having these references on tracks to where you're like, oh, okay, so that's referencing that. Does that mean that there's the shared context between these songs? Where Kendrick, you see the degree to which he like laid out the story and really connected track to track on Good Kid, Mad City through the scenes, then on To Pimp a Butterfly through the poem, and then on Damn just through, he got way more, not experimental, but way more like highbrow artsy with how he did it on Damn. It's like the intro, the outro, some of the sonic elements, it's far less telling and more showing on there, which is that journey through his discography has been really interesting to see that development. We used to talk about how like Kendrick on Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly was kind of in the vein of Steven Spielberg in that there's a lot of depth and a lot of emotion, but it's really done in a way to where it's accessible for so many to be able to like follow along and enjoy, compared to maybe what Kanye's doing, we would say is more like Stanley Kubrick in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where you kind of get that there's things that are there, but may not always be able to pick up on the story as easily as with some others.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, and I think Kendrick specifically, it's cool that he has chosen to kind of reinvent the storytelling aspect that on each album. You know, each album has its own way of telling the story. Like, for instance, the non-linear narrative of Good Kid, Mad City, where it's almost like Quentin Tarantino style, where you're getting an overall story, but it's not told in real time. It's, you know, you get the opening scene is a scene that you're going to see later in the film or in the story, and it kind of jumps around, but then at the end you get it. Whereas To Pimp a Butterfly is very linear from start to finish. It's a, you know, there's no diversion in time. And then Damn, it's, yeah, like you said, it's something else entirely. It's frontwards, backwards. It's impressionistic almost, with the way each song kind of expresses one aspect of humanity or the DNA, quote unquote, in us all. And it's almost like you have to zoom out really far to understand what's going on. But also that allows you to enjoy it just as it's a very easy listen. But also if you zoom out far enough, you realize, oh shit, like some really crazy shit's going on here. But yeah, I mean, I love that kind of stuff. I really geek out on artists that put that much time and effort into crafting that, because it's so hard to do. It's incredibly hard to do in music. It's hard enough to just write a song, to write a good song. And that's enough for the majority of artists, is just to write great songs and put them together and you know, put it out. But to then take the extra steps to, one, make the, you know, just the effort involved in something like that, but also the sacrifices. I would say there's a lot of commercial sacrifices, specifically with Kendrick, that he makes, especially in his earlier albums, where he probably left a lot of songs off. Well, I know he left a lot of songs off, specifically Good Kid, Mad City, because they just didn't fit the narrative. And to do that so early in your career, basically on your first real studio album on Good Kid, Mad City on a major label, that album is crazy for being someone's debut album. In terms of just like I don't give a fuck, I'm making a piece of art over commercial hits, you know? I really think like he didn't sacrifice his message or his just what he wanted to create to try to make it hit. And that's something I really admire about Kendrick specifically, is just from day one, he was so driven by art and expression and storytelling more than he was about hit making. And to see it pay off in the ways that it has is beautiful. Like, there's nothing better in my eyes to see an artist like that win on that level. It's incredible. Kanye is the same way, although I feel like he was very deliberate in hit making in the beginning, and then kind of used his platform later to push boundaries, which again is something I really, really respect, is to have a platform on that level and then use that platform to push the boundaries of art and craft and you know, even fashion and all these things that he's getting into. That is 100% admirable, because it's so easy for him to just continue the formula that he found success in. And I think all the great artists do that. You can see that across Stanley Kubrick's work, for instance. You know, he had one hit early on and used his success to just push the boundaries of filmmaking just to levels that we still are trying to catch up to. And I think the great artists do that. They find commercial success and they use that platform to push, you know, the evolution of culture.
Yeah, it's exciting to see just in all genres. Like, every time I think about what, especially with music being as young of an art form as it is. I mean, music has been around for a long time, but pop music in its current form and like the album in its current form is far newer than like film and literature. It's cool to see.
I mean, it's less than 100 years, I think, right? Or maybe just over 100 years.
Yeah, very, very much.
Yeah.
Like, if you're being generous, it could be 100 years. More likely, like 90, 80.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. So seeing like a lot of the things that you'd see in like literature or novels that have been familiar that cinema has finally picked up on and doing, and you can see the connection between the two. And now seeing music kind of pick up what cinema has done, and that these albums are becoming comparable to movies in a way, is really exciting. And you look at artists like Kendrick, Kanye, Tyler, Creator, Frank Ocean. I feel like they're really going to be like breaking down walls in that way, to where I hope we're going to be seeing more and more albums like this. Like, is this just what the standard for a hip hop album is moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's a trend, at least right now, that you definitely are seeing. J. Cole is experimenting with that. Who like Childish Gambino, all these people, all this new generation seems to be creating in that vein. I'm interested to see like what Chance the Rapper is going to be doing, because he seems like someone that could kind of toy with the narrative if he wanted to. And that's really exciting to me, specifically because, and one reason why I'm so attracted to hip hop, and specifically Kendrick Lamar, is that to me, like the potential for storytelling has never been higher since like opera, when opera had its heyday.
Right.
Specifically with hip hop, because there's no other genre where you can say so many words. In an opera, there's sung passages, but then there's also a lot of like just kind of half sung passages that kind of accelerate the story, and then you get a song about it, etc. But with hip hop, like you can literally simultaneously do both. You can use your verses or whatever to accelerate the narrative forward in a very, I guess, concise and accelerated fashion. But you can also have moments of just reflection through the hook or whatever, however you want to structure it. But just the amount of words you can say in a hip hop album is unprecedented. So someone like Kendrick, who is using that format and really, I feel like, taking it to that next level in terms of storytelling, is really exciting for me. And I hope it's a trend that people catch on to. It seems like Tyler, I think, is actually a good example of someone that, he's young, so he's influenced by Kanye West. He's influenced by this past generation that kind of planted some of those seeds, and you see him now taking it to the next level. And I think hopefully with the great artists, I think they'll see the potential in that, and it would be hard for them to turn their back on it. Especially like Tyler, again, is like, it feels like he's been playing with narrative since the beginning, but he's not abandoning it. He's only refining it with every album. So I can't see him stopping that. I can't see Kendrick stopping. I can't see these artists turning their backs on that potential once they kind of untap it.
It makes me really excited to see what next innovations we'll have too, because I feel like hip hop in a lot of ways is innovating song structure in a way that we're not seeing in rock music or pop music, which seem to really be doubling down on the kind of like franchise idea of this is what a popular song is. Where I feel with hip hop, you're seeing artists get way more experimental with what can I do with chorus? What can I do with hooks, bridges, verses? I'm just going to have like this one long ass verse right here, and that's the song. And you can get away with that in hip hop in a way that I don't feel like I see a lot of people doing in other genres.
Yeah, that's why I've chosen to concentrate so heavily on hip hop. I listen to all music. There's not really a genre of music that I wouldn't listen to, but hip hop specifically right now in this moment is such an exciting genre, just because all the subgenres that you're getting now, because of the experimental, the structural elements that artists are starting to play with. There's just so much happening in this world, this hip hop world right now, that is really pushing, I feel like, music forward more than any other genre, at least any other popular genre. And it's speaking I feel like it's speaking to the times more than any other genre as well in terms of its subject matter. We're hearing voices that we haven't heard before, and stories that we haven't heard before, because usually these guys are coming from like impoverished backgrounds, and you don't really hear from that side of society all the time, especially not on this massive level. So just for so many number of reasons, I feel like hip hop is kind of where it's at right now, culturally speaking. And yeah, it's just really exciting. And I feel like, and we can go back to Kanye on this one, it's like since hip hop has allowed for more singing from rappers, that's when I feel like the boundaries really were just totally stripped away. Hip hop, I felt like a long time, was very restrictive in what was allowed, especially on a commercial level. You had to be talking about a certain thing, you had to look a certain way, and all those boundaries have been blown to pieces. Our biggest hip hop stars right now are like goth, essentially. Like they look like what goth rockers used to look like in like the 90s or whatever. Like, you can have colored hair, you could have piercings, and you can sing, and then you can rap, and you can, you can do whatever the fuck you want now. And I think that's so great, especially coming from where hip hop came from. And that's just evolution. And again, that's since those, freedoms have been unlocked a lot thanks to Kanye. Not only Kanye, but he had a big part in that, especially on a commercial level. I feel like that's why we're seeing so much great things being accomplished in hip hop right now. Even if the music's not always great, at least like there's things that are being tried, experimented with, and that's the only way to push things forward.
Do you have an artist that you currently think is really underrated? Like, doesn't have to have a narrative album, but just somebody that you're like, I think they're underrated. I'm really excited to see like what they come out with or what they do. People should be listening to them.
Let's see. I mean, on the top of my head, to be honest, Tyler was like in that category for me. Probably not as low key as you're attempting to get now, but I feel like Tyler was the most unproven artist on, like, to me, like doing Kendrick, doing Kanye, even Frank Ocean, it fits, they're on a caliber of artistry that not a lot of, contemporary artists get to, and they're revered in a way that not a lot of artists are revered as. Tyler, to me, I felt like was not on that level, and picking Flower Boy was almost like a leap of faith for me to kind of, in my own head, put the stamp on Tyler as creating, or at least getting to a level of these other guys. And to be, with Igor, I feel like he has only validated that opinion. You can see the trajectory that he's on, and he's definitely not someone that was he was not, his relevancy or the attention that he gets was not ever in question, but I feel like his artistry was. And, that's again why I kind of picked Flower Boy, because I think that was him proving that he could be on that level. Trying to think of any other artists on the top of my head that are doing that. Nothing's really coming to mind right away. Plus, to be honest, I listen to, the majority of what I listen to is pretty, I wouldn't say mainstream, but it's people that you've heard of most of the time. But if I give it some more thought, maybe I'll think of it.
Yeah. I feel like I don't listen to enough up and coming music to know a lot of up and coming people in that way, but Tyler is definitely one that would have jumped out to me before Igor. Even with Flower Boy, I remember when Flower Boy came out, Travis, the co-host of the show, for anybody this is their first time listening to Watching the Throne, said that this album, he's just like, I think Tyler just made like this art album that I love and enjoy and didn't expect from Tyler. And a few of us in the group chat were just like, Tyler, the creator, did what? Because that just wasn't what you associated him with. Yeah, no, definitely. And
for Tyler specifically, his evolution is so cool to me. Just knowing where he came from, he was essentially just like a punk skateboarder kid that made music and got popular, just as much for his antics than he did for his music. And there's only a few ways that story ends most of the time. It's either a fizzle out, just kind of goes away, one hit wonder, or just, Odd Future had their moment and that was cool, but it didn't really last. Or they get a drug addiction or whatever, a lot of times it gets ugly. Or you can do what Tyler did and really tone the antics down, matured as a person, and just kept creating art. And we come to realize that he was always about the art from day one, and he just got famous really young. And so a lot of his early work wasn't on the level that maybe we wanted consistently. But again, he was 19, 20, 21 years old when he was creating these things. And I think Earl Sweatshirt said, they got famous on their rough drafts, they really did. Earl was like 15 literally when Odd Future blew up. So, and they're putting out music and people are listening to it, and that's weird. You're 15 years old and people want to hear what you have to say. And of course it's going to be unpolished. Of course it's not going to be everything that you want it to be in retrospect. But again, Tyler, Earl, Frank, all these guys, the evolution that they've now had over the last 10 years is amazing. And they're using their platforms in the right way. They're growing as artists, growing as people. And it's been really, really cool to watch.
I'm just imagining what Kanye was 27 when The College Dropout came out.
Yeah,
and
which is what Tyler's age when he created Flower Boy, by the way.
Yeah, imagine like if Flower Boy was Tyler's debut album and the response that he would get or the attention he would get. Just imagine the difference if we were listening to Kanye for 10 years and hearing some of his rough drafts before like reaching that point. Yeah, that's just kind of wild to think about.
Yeah, if you hear some of those early Kanye tracks, I'm forgetting the names of them, but there's some ones where he had that group. I forgot what the group was called.
Oh yeah, I
should
know this. Yeah, we talk about them, especially they came up a few times on College Dropout when we were doing our dropout analyses recently. Oh, this is gonna bother me that I can't.
Yeah, I know, me too. But point is, like, some of the songs were not great. If those songs were officially put out under Kanye West, we would definitely think differently about his early work. And that's probably about the age that Tyler was when he was putting out his early work. So yeah, so we saw Tyler as a work in progress, for the first 5-6 years of him making music. It wasn't until really Cherry Bomb. I mean, you always saw moments. That was the thing with Tyler. You always saw moments of brilliance. There'd be a song or a passage or a beat that you're just like, wow, this is amazing. But it just wouldn't hold through for the entire album. So for him to kind of consolidate his powers, so to speak, and create something like a Flower Boy or something like Igor, and really get to that level that he's always been seeking and working towards and working really hard to get there. Again, it's inspiring. It's great. It's beautiful.
The Go-Getters. That's
yeah, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Even the name, Jesus Christ, that's a bad name.
Yeah. Right. Like motivational, like, yeah, we're the Go-Getters, but it just doesn't.
Yeah.
Don't think it would translate in the same way.
Yeah. Like, even like him using his real name, Kanye, like that was definitely different back then to just call yourself by your real name. You always had some kind of rap alias.
That's true. Like, what was it? P. Diddy, like Biggie, Tupac, like DMX, Jay-Z.
Yeah. Yeah, you never heard. It was always like R&B you would hear. Sometimes they would use their real name, but in rap,
Brian McKnight.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, even Kendrick Lamar, him realizing that K-Dot was not the name that was appropriate. And when he transitioned to Kendrick Lamar, which is his first and middle name, that's when he said his music really shifted because he wanted to get more personal. And the Kendrick Lamar EP, the first thing that he did under that name, is a great listen, and it's incredibly personal, and that you can trace the trajectory of his career from the name change from the Kendrick Lamar EP to where he is now. That's when he really started working towards what he became, and wasn't so much just like a young mixtape Lil Wayne wannabe, basically, which was a lot of his early work was very derivative and very just kind of in the vein of what you heard, on mixtapes or Lil Wayne or whatever. So that's kind of an interesting footnote to kind of what we're talking about.
Do you think Tyler's going through maybe a similar thing? Because a lot of the promotional material for Igor, it was just Tyler Okamba.
Tyler. Oh, yeah. I don't know. I think he did that on Flower Boy too. Just the whole written produced thing. Yeah, I think he definitely did that on Flower Boy. I would have to look back to see if he used to do that in his earlier works, but he's definitely someone that is trying to be very deliberate in that he is doing this all himself, which I think is important for him to point out, because even with like someone like Kanye, who we all really respect, he is definitely not doing it alone. He has a team that he's kind of curating at this point. I think earlier you could say that he was doing everything, but now he's more of a curator than anything, I feel like. But Tyler is still doing it all, which I think is interesting choice. And for Tyler specifically too, like what I think is really, really special about him is that he's playing everything as well. He's composing all the chord progressions, which
is crazy.
and the way that he's able to work that into hip hop, and I guess you can't really categorize him as hip hop now, but there's so like jazz, soul harmonies, really complex chords, really strange chord progressions that he's able to kind of put in as the basis of his beats, but still do it in a way that sounds hip hop, still just expresses that attitude of hip hop, I guess, and then he raps over it, of course. So that was another reason why I picked Flower Boy, because it was just so harmonically and musically rich that it really allowed me to talk about all the things that he's doing that you wouldn't really expect, nor do you really ever hear from a hip hop artist. I can't really think of someone that creates as harmonically rich beats than Tyler does, because his chord progressions are just so wild. And a lot of times in hip hop, you don't even get a chord progression. It's just like a loop of a melody or a loop of a sample or something. And a lot of times the songs go somewhere, whereas hip hop a lot of times is just one loop repeated with variation over and over. Tyler has, in 911 Mr. Lonely, I think there's 8 different chord progressions, which is insane. Like even in a
Wow.
rock song or something, it's like you get 2, maybe 3 chord progressions. Like that song has literally 8 chord progressions, and it all is seamless. And that's the kind of stuff that I get really excited about as a musician to point out to people, because I know a lot of people wouldn't really hear that if you're not kind of trained to hear that. So again, that's another reason why I feel like Tyler's special, that he's doing it all himself, but also what he's doing and what he's assimilating together, especially when like Igor is a perfect example too, of like him just taking all these really disparate influences and sounds and ideas and just kind of finding a way to make it sound cohesive. I thought was really impressive.
I think you'd get a kick. I saw a tweet, I think it was yesterday or just the day before, recently, where somebody was saying the fact that Tyler produced and made everything on Igor was so impressive to me. This is what they were saying. I wish Kanye would do the same thing so I could really hear how good of a producer he is. And rather than having like so many co-producers and everything, which was kind of crazy to me to think about, because we know that Kanye went from being on the outside, being that industrious person that's doing everything himself, to now, as you described earlier, kind of having this team that he directs. It's still his vision, and he still does all kind of the final things to get it to where he wants, but he's kind of outsourcing some of the work to where he can focus on other things. But it was cool to me for Tyler to see people recognize like what he's doing. It means that there's some work to do regarding Kanye's legacy in terms of helping people understand just how deep he is in the production and what his process is. Like that having a co-producer doesn't mean you didn't do work or that it's not your vision, but I just thought that was really exciting for Tyler to be getting that kind of praise up against somebody like Kanye for the production he did on these last two albums.
Yeah, I think, I wouldn't agree with the comparison from that tweet, but I do, it's great for Tyler, and I agree that people don't understand, and especially I get it, like if you haven't done music yourself, like, or if you don't know Kanye's story, that he used to do it all himself, so he definitely could if he wanted to. Even knowing that Kanye could do it but doesn't, just tells me that he is more concerned with the final product than anything else. He doesn't care if he gets all the credit, or maybe he does, I don't know. But it's on strictly musical terms, on art terms, he just seems to care about the final product. And if that means outsourcing to someone he feels like is really good at the drums and outsourcing the sample, outsourcing the hook, like he's creating something that he could not create on his own. And I think that's almost the point, is like he knows his limitations, and he's going to make creative decisions to make sure that the track, becomes all it can be, no matter what that means. That sometimes that for him, that means that he's barely even on the track himself. Like I feel like that's one interesting thing about like Pablo in particular, is like a lot of those tracks he's like barely even comes in on, or isn't the main focus. His voice is not the main focus. And I think that's pretty cool. As long as it's a great song at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what it took to get there. And if, in Kanye's case, it's the vision is at least now it's his best skill. I feel like it's like he has the vision and he does what it takes to get that vision kind of fulfilled. And I think that's way harder than people realize. It's like saying a director doesn't do anything, right? It's the same thing. Like the director doesn't act, the director doesn't write the script, but the director has everything to do with the final product.
Which is why we give, that's always been one of the interesting comparisons, and it gets back to what we were talking about with like cinema and music and maybe the early growing pains that music's still going through. Like people recognize what the director does, but with musicians and hip hop in general, it seems like if you have anybody help write on a song, they're like, oh no, you did it. That's not authentic now. And it's like, do you know how many people help edit novels or like have helped edit poets over the years, like centuries? Like there's always editors and advice givers and contributions to things. This idea that hip hop is somehow like above having anybody bring in influence or help is always so funny to me.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to like the evolution of the genre in general, and some of the limitations that were put on hip hop early on. Some can view, I get where the whole pride of pen and lyricism comes in, because that was what hip hop was at its core. That was your superpower, was your lyricism and the way that you delivered that. But hip hop has changed so much since then, and to think that it could stay, it could grow and still stay in that mindset, is just, I think, wrong. Like it's impossible. I think you would hit a dead end with where hip hop could go if you kept that strict mentality. I think it still applies with people like Kendrick and Cole and those types of artists. But, you have people like Drake doing great things for what he does, and using hip hop and just kind of bending it a little bit to make what are very, very popular songs. To me, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having a ghostwriter. Even like Kanye's case, he has ghostwriters a lot of the times. And again, to me, it's about evolution. It's about experimentation. It's about just making the best product possible, the most interesting thing possible. And if that takes collaboration, I mean, what do we care?
Right. We benefit. At the end of the day, we get a product we enjoy and like, and products.
Yeah. Imagine a filmmaker trying to, film the movie himself, trying to act in the movie himself, or like, you know, trying to do everything. Those are just limitations that you could, you know, with some help, easily overcome.
Very much so. Well, I think we're at the point where we get to do your last call, where you just have an uninterrupted period closing out the show to talk about anything that you want to talk about. And that'll be how we close. So, Cole, thank you very much for coming on and sharing so much. And now, here's your last call.
Sick. Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me. Yeah, for anyone that hasn't listened to Dissect, you can find it wherever. Prefer you listen to it on Spotify. You get episodes a week early and all that. But yeah, just check it out if you haven't. If you're a fan of Watching the Throne, I think you'll definitely be a fan of Dissect. Yeah, and I mean, knowing that we're speaking to the audience that we have, I just, you know, I don't get to say this a lot on my show since it's very structured, but, you know, I appreciate everyone that listens, because I know if you're able to listen to what we do, that you're like-minded in terms of like wanting to learn more about the things that you love and that you're passionate about, and uncovering all the details that make great music great, but also just great art great, and really trying to extract everything you can from these great works of art. And I'm really appreciative that, and I'm sure you feel the same way, that we've found audiences that appreciate that stuff, because not everyone does. And to listen to our kind of work, you know, it takes a certain type of mind, and you know, if you're listening to this, you likely have that type of mind as well. And I think that's what's a beautiful thing about podcasts, is that we can find these communities and really kind of share in our appreciation of these great works and provide insights. So yeah, check out Dissect if you haven't. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. It's great.